Good day. This is Hansjörg Mixdorff. I hope this presentation finds you in good health. I'm presenting our work on the perception of audiovisual expressions by native speakers of Hindi. This is a follow-up of earlier works by myself and colleagues Rilliard and Angelika Hönemann. We are now supported for this work by Debashis Ghosh from IIT Roorkee. Yeah, give a quick overview of the topics that I'm going to touch on. Since this is a video presentation and I'm not terribly constrained by time, I have a chance to give a more thorough introduction to the topic of attitudinal prosody, which some of you might not be familiar with. Then I talk about the experiment design, the way we process the data, and then of course give you experiment results, and finally discussion and conclusion. So first of all, the way we look at paralinguistic features is a little bit different from let's say previous studies that are basically looked at different categories of emotions like happiness, sadness, etc., often portrayed and like stereotypically presented by actors, find acoustic and visual differences. So what we're more interested in is the way we use attitude and emotional expressions in a communicative situation that has a, let's say, very often a conscious selection process underneath. Attitudes can be thought of as basically coping patterns for different communicative situations, either with the social content, meaning reflective of your position in the societal hierarchy, or propositional in with respect to the truthfulness of an assertion. Now, the problem that we usually faced with is like how to record these expressions of attitude in a natural setting while maintaining a very high recording quality. So Rilliard and his co-workers developed a framework in which attitudes are characterized by descriptions of situations, depending of the type of attitude and the context of its portrayal. And what is also very important is that recordings not only concern the acoustic channel, but also facial gestures. This is a list of attitudes that we have been looking at, ranging from so-called neutral statement questions over doubt, uncertainty, surprise, admiration, to very maybe negatively perceived attitudes such as arrogance and contempt. And as you can see, each of these attitudes can be classified with respect to their propositional and social qualities. Depending on the way we describe the situation, the conversational situation, there are hierarchical distances. So you might be talking to your equal or talking to your boss. Of course, that will generate different behaviors. And of course, what is very important and one of the main features of attitudes is their valence. Now, attitudes were elicited by immersing the people producing those attitudes in short dialogues. And all these dialogues ended in so-called target sentences, either a banana or Mary was dancing, and of course that translated to the respective stimulus languages. Now, The procedure foresees that we first perform an immersive test dialogue that somehow familiarizes the presenter with the situation of that attitude, and then the recording or the target dialogue proper. So, as I already mentioned, type of speech act, propositional, social, hierarchical, societal, distance, etc. are varied throughout 16 of these communicative situations. Now, very often our presenters were not only aided by conversational descriptions, but also simply pictures like this arrogant banana shows us. Now, what can you do with these target utterances, with these target videos? First of all, what is very important is that you perform an assessment of the perceived quality of that. So when I say, first of all, a perceiver, of course, within the same native language, is presented this stimulus, the question is, to what extent does the performer actually invoke the or present the intended attitude? So that gives you already some kind of quality assurance regarding the usefulness of these stimuli or these recordings, which are going to turn into stimuli in the subsequent experiments. Okay, so that's the first step in our perception experiments. The next step was identifying an attitude from a set of given labels. So what we did was basically investigate which attitudes were close partners, or we call them distractor attitudes, which present quite similar visual and acoustic results. Think, for instance, of arrogance versus contempt versus irritation versus authority. These are quite closely related attitudes. So what we did was basically in this identification experiment, we presented the perceivers with basically the correct label, 2 distractor attitudes, and 2 randomly chosen attitudes. One thing I should mention as well is, of course, depending on the communicational situation, these attitudes can be either assertive in terms of their linguistic structure or interrogative. Okay, so another type of analysis that we performed on the stimulus is acoustic analysis of the prosodic features. And then, last not least, of course, a visual analysis of the non-verbal facial gestures. Now, when we used the identification experiment and evaluated, of course, we realized that by providing a set of given labels, we subject the raters to a certain bias. And therefore, we decided to turn to something that we call free labeling. So basically what the raters will do is, viewing one of the stimulus utterances, they are asked to provide a label, preferably just a single word or maybe a short phrase. And this is what we call the free labeling experiment. Now, what is also interesting in this context is whether the full AV, that means full audiovisual stimuli, and acoustic only stimuli differ with respect to the perception. Because as we've found in earlier experiments, is that the acoustic channel lends itself very well to the transmission of the linguistic information, but emotional information is also very strongly expressed by. I'll just give you a few examples from German, and just for a quick, let's say, introduction, here are also some displays of acoustic features. So for instance, if we look at this surprised question,
Eine Banane?
we see the F0 contour. This is what is depicted here. Has a very strong excursion at the end, and plateaus off. There's also let's say a secondary prominence on eine, and if you just compare it to a simple question,
Eine Banane?
you see the contour is very, I'd say, very plain. Of course, there's a rise at the end, but the interval is not as large. And then what you can also see is that the duration is stretched in the surprised question. Have a look at two assertions. The first one is admiration.
Eine Banane.
And you see there's a strong excursion on both words, whereas in a neutral declarative,
Eine Banane.
you see the F0 contour is very flat. So that gives you an impression of how different attitudes are. Now, what we turn to right now is the analysis of the two corpora that we collected, and there's one corpus of German and one corpus of Cantonese that was collected in conjunction with the Chinese University of Hong Kong. Now, why these two languages? There are quite a few differences here. They have a non-tone language versus tone language. We have a stress-timed language and a syllable-timed language, and also presumably two cultures that are significantly different. The other aspect which is quite interesting is none of the subjects knows the other language, right? And so this juxtaposition of different languages and cultures hopefully will yield for us a better insight into the differences between the cultures. Now, what we find from our earlier experiments, of course, there's a considerable overlap. So similar attitudes are clustered more closely together. What we found with Germans evaluating Cantonese speakers, they perceive less activation, they perceive slightly less positive vibration, if you like, and there's also an interesting let's say misunderstanding in the sense that Cantonese speakers that have produced interrogative mode in their tonal languages were also judged more activated, although they just were producing questions, of course, with a certain interval of F0. Okay, so these are, for instance, two snapshots from our Cantonese stimuli, and yeah, they should play, but they don't play anyway. So what you see, this is supposed to be surprise, this is supposed to be irritation. I think they were just snapshots. There are no videos embedded here. So this is also something that we found in the presenters of Cantonese, that their productions seem more restrained. Okay, so just to sum up, the current design is very similar to what we've done so far in the free rating experiments. So I think I don't have to go into this very deeply. Here's just a number of the stimuli, and what is also interesting is that we looked at audio only, video only, and then the full auditory visual stimuli. Now, we had to choose which sentence, either Mary was dancing or a banana, was going to be selected, and because of the similarity in syllable content, we used Mary was dancing for the Cantonese stimuli and a banana, eine Banane, for the German ones. Eventually, we had 10 different presenters from Hong Kong and 20 from Germany in the set of stimuli. And as I said, we selected those based on the perceived quality of their productions. Okay, so the perceivers are presented 8 full AV stimuli, which were not used in the actual test, for warm-up, and then they require, depending on the individual, between 25 and 45 minutes to complete the task. So as I said, the raters now in this experiment are native speakers of Hindi from Indian Institute of Technology in Roorkee. What is interesting about Hindi, of course, it's neither a tone nor a stress-timed language, although, as I pointed out, since it's always the same target utterance, there isn't much. There shouldn't be much of an influence in this respect, the type of language. Now, in earlier experiments, we already used a three-dimensional scale to evaluate, to assess the terms, the words that were associated in the free labeling task, and which is quite commonplace. There's a three-dimensional system. I think valence is in most is part of most systems in the sense that an expression can be perceived positive or negative, and then there are the other dimensions are dominance and arousal. Now this is a scale that was used by Warner, Cooperman, and Brisbard, who collected reactions to almost 14,000 lemmas of American English. And they evaluated these three dimensions. I think they were evaluated separately on each of the word targets. Okay, so let's just get a quick comparison between the rating systems of our earlier experiments and the current one. Now, in the earlier experiments, we had the dimensions valence, activation, and dominance. And activation was defined as the investedness on the part of the talker. Dominance was the amount of control exerted on the listener by the talker. So what we saw is that this diverges from Warner et al. in the sense that their arousal dimension is a degree of calmness on the part of the perceiver, and dominance is the amount of control perceived by the perceiver. In the early experiments, we used the terms in the native language and had native listeners or native experts assign levels -1, 0, and 1 for each of the three dimensions, whereas Warner et al. Used a scale from 1 to 9 assigned to these American English terms. So in the current experiments, what we have to do is we have to translate all the labels that we had from Cantonese and German to English to gain a comparison. So what we found is that on the same words, the valence ratings were quite highly correlated, but lower so for dominance, and basically no correlation at all between activation and arousal. So these are completely different dimensions in the two systems. Now, why did we turn to English as the language to do this evaluation on? Is simply because, to our surprise, all speakers or all raters in India felt much more comfortable to rate the expressions using English and not their native Hindi language. One observation that we made with these raters, as we did in earlier experiments, is that they use two words or whole phrase, so we had to normalize with respect to part of speech and by synonym mapping. And what was also very important is that we had to make sure that they were contained in the list of 14,000 lemmas. And yeah, we did the same for the German and Cantonese speaking perceivers, the labels are. So if we look at the results, here are the 16 attitudes and the respective abbreviations. And what we can see for the valence ratings, intuitively we find admiration has a positive valence, whereas for instance contempt is quite negatively has a quite negative connotation. Sincerity is positive, and irritation is also negative. For the arousal levels, it's very undecided. You can see that all the mean values for each attitude, so collected for all three experiments, is negative. And the range of arousal is also quite small. So this comes as a surprise, but apparently when the raters are confronted with the word dilemma, they are in a different situation and they don't feel as compelled as when they are confronted with a video expression. So that might explain why the arousal levels are quite small. Dominance, has a very small ratings for uncertainty, as we can see, whereas admiration has a positive value. So people who are like sincere or perceived as sincere or admiring, they are quite calm in their stand. Okay, so first of all, we looked at the differences between the three rater groups and the stimulus languages, and we can see almost all parameters, the attitude, the stimulus language, rater language, and even combined features yield significance in this GLM that we produced. And the only factor that we couldn't find a significant difference is dominance with respect to the stimulus language. So if we look at the differences within the rater populations, depending on whether the stimulus is either German or Cantonese, we can see that German raters consistently find higher valence, higher arousal, and higher dominance in the Cantonese stimuli, in the German stimuli, as opposed to the Cantonese stimuli. Whereas when we look at the Cantonese raters, there's only in terms of arousal they find a stronger reaction in the German, and the Hindi speakers find slightly higher valence in the German stimuli as opposed to the Cantonese ones. Now, if we look at the differences between pairs, within pairs of languages, what we can find in this lineup is that in general, Hindi perceivers assign higher valence levels, Germans assign higher arousal levels, and then of course there are a few more differences that are displayed in this table. If we turn now from attitudes in general to the stimulus-wise means, we get a data point in the three-dimensional system for each stimulus. Each concrete stimulus is a dot in these diagrams. On the left-hand side, we see German stimuli, and on the right-hand side, the Cantonese stimuli. And just visually, we can see that there's a higher valence in general for the Hindi perceivers, and then there's a very small, seems to be a cluster of a few stimuli, Cantonese stimuli, that are assessed more positively by the Cantonese perceivers than perceivers of the other two languages. These are all low dominant stimuli that are assessed more positively. Now the question arises, what is the agreement between the rater groups in terms of the three dimensions? First of all, we look at the German stimuli. So the agreement between two splits within the German group is almost 0.8 with respect to valence, and it's less for arousal and dominance. If we look at the agreement between German and Cantonese on German stimuli, of course the agreement is smaller, and it is very low with respect to the arousal rating. Okay, so this is the arousal seems to be the area where Cantonese and German stimuli don't agree very well. And we see the same pattern when we look at the Cantonese stimuli. There's a very low agreement between Cantonese and German raters. And what is also interesting is that Hindi perceivers are in better agreement with Cantonese and German perceivers than the Cantonese with the Germans, right? So that is also an important observation. One thing that is has to be conceded here is that because valence and dominance are very strongly correlated already in the list of 14,000 lemmas, has a high correlation. Of course, the ratings between these two dimensions is also highly correlated. Okay, so the only point where we find a disagreement is actually in the arousal domain, in the arousal dimension. If we turn to some of the most frequent labels assigned to the attitude, depending on the rater language, so we have DE for German, Cantonese for CAN for Cantonese, and Hindi here. What we can see is that very often negative attitudes are interpreted as sad or and calm by the speakers of Hindi, and seductiveness, for instance, that is perceived as such by the German perceivers, is often misinterpreted by Cantonese perceivers as glad or happy. Another thing that is quite interesting is that very often there's an element of anger or suspicion perceived by the raters of Cantonese and Hindi. For instance, in the neutral question, there's some negative connotation there. So there are quite a few nice details with respect to these the differences, which I won't be able to discuss in full detail in this presentation. Okay, so I presented to you results from an experiment on attitudinal expressions. We had Hindi perceivers rate German and Cantonese stimuli. And what we find is that there's a good agreement with respect to the valence dimension, but apparently Hindi perceivers are closer to Cantonese and Germans than the other two groups are to each other, which somehow matches that geographic and cultural distance in the sense that India occupies somewhat a middle position, middle ground between Europe and the Far East. As you can imagine, future work will imply the collection of these attitudinal expressions by speakers of Hindi and related perception experiments with the other groups. Okay, thanks for your attention and stay safe and healthy.